At some point, video games stopped selling games. They started selling numbers. First, it was bits, but when that number failed, a new one took its place. And that number started showing up everywhere in magazines, commercials, and console war arguments. It was supposed to explain which system was more powerful, and yet it explained almost nothing. That number was polygons per second. Now, today, it's mostly forgotten, but for an entire generation, it defined how we understood graphics until the industry quietly moved on. The question is, why? In the early days of gaming, visuals weren't judged on realism. Nobody confused Pong for real tennis, and nobody was asking it to be. Nobody expected Space Invaders to look like an actual alien invasion. Games communicated ideas, not simulations. But as hardware improved, developers began experimenting with true 3D graphics. Not tricks, not sprites, but actual geometry. And once objects existed in 3D space, a new question emerged. How do you measure visual power when it comes to 3D? That question opened the door to polygons. At its simplest, a polygon is a flat shape, usually a triangle. Stack enough of them together and you can approximate curves. Here's the mental model to remember because everything else in this video builds on it. Polygons are like a skeleton. They give you the basic outline or structure of a thing, but it doesn't tell you how alive that thing feels. However, polygons, like bones, are easy to count. And that made polygons incredibly attractive to marketing teams. So polygons per second wasn't chosen by accident. It was the perfect marketing number. They were easy to explain, easy to compare. They sounded scientific. And most importantly, they were impossible for consumers to verify, which from a marketing perspective is kind of ideal. In other words, they felt objective. Visual quality is subjective, but polygon counts didn't feel that way. So when Sony said the original PlayStation could push around 360,000 polygons per second, that number spread everywhere. Sega responded with Saturn figures that looked even better on paper. And just like that, a new console arms race began. But there was only one issue. Those numbers weren't describing actual games. They were describing ideal test conditions. Conditions that had no textures, no lighting, no animation, no gameplay. In real games, everything competes for resources. So while consoles could theoretically push hundreds of thousands of polygons per second, actual games used far less. That's why early 3D characters were built from only a few hundred polygons. That's why environments were sparse and angular. Why fog became a design feature, not a bug. The question wasn't how many polygons a console could draw, it was how many you could afford once everything else showed up. Then there was arcade hardware, which actually complicates the story. It also reveals something very important. In arcades, polygon counts actually made sense. For instance, Sega's Model 1 hardware, used for the game Virtua Fighter, could push around 180,000 polygons per second in real gameplay. Not because arcades were more honest, but because they were purpose-built. An arcade cabinet ran one game, one fixed environment. It didn't need flexibility. It didn't need to hit a price point. It just needed to look impressive. That made arcades the perfect place for polygon numbers, and home consoles the worst. Using the same stat to compare both flattened those differences, but it made for great headlines. And once marketing realized that, the numbers only got bigger. And that was a problem, because polygon counts didn't just mislead consumers, they shaped development priorities. Studios felt pressure to hit performance targets first, to simplify environments, to rely on fog and draw distance tricks, and to prioritize geometry over a game's feel. Early 5th generation games often look rough, not because developers lacked talent, but because everyone was still learning how to work within these harsh constraints. In many cases, the goal was not to make the game look great, it was to get it running at all. At this point, it would have been easy to assume things could only improve with stronger hardware, but that's not what happened. By the middle of the 5th generation, something interesting was taking shape. The hardware didn't change, but the games did. Developers stopped trying to out-polygon the problem. They got smarter. Instead of adding geometry, they focused on using what they already had. Better texture work, smarter camera placement, controlled environments, and guiding what the player could actually see. Late generation games looked cleaner, more stable, and more confident, not because the consoles got stronger, but because the developers understood them better. The polygon budget stayed the same, but the craftsmanship drastically improved. Oddly though, just as developers were finally mastering fixed hardware, the next generation arrived, and with it the biggest numbers the industry had ever seen. Sony claimed the PlayStation 2 could push 66 million polygons per second. That number was everywhere. It sounded definitive, like the conversation was finally over. Except no PS2 game ever came close to that figure in real-world conditions. Once again, the number described a best-case scenario, not the experience players actually saw. The lesson of the 5th generation hadn't been learned. It had been reset, but not for long. By the early 2000s, something had shifted. Visual improvements stopped coming from raw geometry. They came from lighting, animation, materials, composition. On paper, the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox all advertised different polygon counts. But in practice, especially with cross-platform games, it was often hard to tell them apart. The numbers were different, but you couldn't necessarily tell just by the results. At that point, polygon counts stopped being useful, even as a marketing shortcut. So the industry quietly moved on. No announcement, no correction, just new metrics, because once again, the old ones had stopped doing their job. Polygons didn't disappear, but they were replaced by things like resolution, frame rate, teraflops, AI upscaling. Different technology, same psychology. A single number that sounds definitive and never tells the whole story. Because games are not just skeletons. When done right, they're living, breathing, one-of-a-kind experiences. So the next time you see a massive number used to sell a console, pause for a second. What do you think it's actually trying to sell you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.